This one is for all the Quran only Muslims. First, I want to say that this concept of I'm just going to rely only on the Quran alone and reject all the hadith, this is not a new thing. The Prophet ﷺ said that Islam will break up into sects like the previous nations did, particularly the Jews and Christians. But it also says that you will, in another hadith, he says, alayhi salatu wasalam, that you will make all the same mistakes that the people of the book made. And so, what are the same mistakes? And one of them is clearly this Quran only, which sounds so spectacular on the surface. Like, yeah, Quran only. Why would I accept anything other than the Quran, right? But the Quran itself says to follow the example of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. It wouldn't say that if that was not needed, you know? And so also there's a sect of Jews called the Karaites that have the exact same mentality as the Quran only Muslims, and they existed before. This is from like when Islam was in its early days of Islam. So we didn't even have the Quran only Muslims yet, but the Jews already had the Karaites, which were the Torah only Jews. And again, that sounds really awesome too, right? They rejected all oral tradition, they rejected everything. So, but you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. Of course, there's stuff that is not going to be completely true. Like we have Daif hadith and certain things that have weaker chains, and maybe the words are not exactly how the Prophet ﷺ said it, but like the general part of it is true. So we have a science of grading hadith because of that phenomenon. Now, to throw everything out, you open the door for so much danger that you don't realize, because there's so many things in the Quran, just like in the Bible, that without context, it's going to look crazy. And if you throw out all the hadith and the oral tradition, you won't have the context to say, no, this was about a particular battle or a particular incident. This is not a thing that you go out and do. But then the Quran only Muslims, they do that. They say, like, oh, no, no, this is not, for, there's a background to this. No, you can't use background. You've deleted yourself from using background. You've removed that option. You can't pick and choose like a buffet. Either there's an oral tradition or there's not. Either it matters or it doesn't. So we made the Prophet alayhi salatu Islam is the prophet, and he prophesied, and a prophet prophesizes and it comes true. And so we have the same thing that the Jews have now, and we have a group of people that they reject the oral tradition completely. So I wanted to do a little experiment. I wanted to ask ChatGPT, which a lot of people are doing this now, but let's see what it says. That I'm gonna do this because Muttawatir is something that's agreed upon. Like meaning this is not like one Sahabi heard it. This is like multiple like the Exodus of Egypt is Muttawatir. All of Bani Israel came out and they all saw it. They all saw the Red Sea split. It wasn't one person. It was the whole nation. They saw the mountain. They saw Mount Sinai, everything, all the miracles. It's Muttawatir. Anything that thousands of people hear, like the Prophet alayhi salatu Islam's farewell sermon, that's Muttawatir. Thousands of people were there and heard that farewell sermon. So it's like to deny that and what's written about that everyone agreed upon that, yeah, that's what he said. That's ridiculous to deny it. Every society in the world functions on what's Muttawatir. Muttawatir is what's agreed upon. That's witnesses. And in a court case, you need only a few witnesses to confirm, and the judge will make a verdict on that. Imagine like hundreds, tens, dozens, thousands of people seeing something and saying, yeah, this is what happened. How can you deny that? You know? So let's do this. Let's ask ChatGPT, if you just follow the Quran and what's mutawatir, just those two things. Forget about the singular hadith that are like only one Sahabi narrated. I'm talking about only mutawatir. So like multiple people saw it. So at least we have that. Let's follow the Quran and what's mutawatir and see what we have of Islam. Hey, if we take the Quran and only the Muttawatir hadith, what would we have still in Islam that we would have to practice?
If you focus solely on the Quran and the Muttawatir hadith, those hadith passed down by such a large number of people that it's virtually impossible they fabricated it, you'd still have the foundational beliefs monotheism, prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, but many of the details of how to perform these acts, such as the exact form of prayer, the number of units in each prayer, or intricate legal rulings, are often derived from other hadith. So you'd have the core pillars, but many practical details would likely be less defined.
What would you have as far as salah? What details would you have?
From the Quran alone, you'd have the core mandate to establish salah, times of prayer like at dawn, noon, late afternoon, sunset, and night. But specific details like the exact movements, number of rakas for each prayer, or the tashahhud are mostly found in hadith. Mutawatir hadith, though few, would still confirm some key elements like reciting al-Fatiha and bowing and prostrating. So you'd have the basic structure, but not all the fine details.
So if someone followed the Quran and the Mutawatir hadith alone, they would still pray 5 times a day, and they would still have to do sujood and recite Surah Fatiha when standing.
Yes, exactly. Those core elements, five daily prayers, sujood, prostration, and reciting Al Fatiha, would still be practiced because they're well established. The finer points, like exact postures, sequences, or additional supplications, might be less detailed, but the essential framework would remain.
So if someone followed the Quran and Mutawatir hadith, and that was core for them as far as being a practicing Muslim and following it correctly, if they didn't stand and do Surah Fatiha 5 times a day at fixed times and do sujood in those same times, they would not be following Islam properly.
Yes, based on that premise, they wouldn't be fulfilling the poor obligations. Since the Quran and Mutawatir Hadith establish both the prayer times and key elements like Al Fatiha and Sujood, skipping those would mean they're not adhering to the essential framework of Islamic practice.
Okay, I just had to mute it because I want to say at that point, bro, just do salah. You're already doing the main thing. What would they look like if you took a Quranist and you took someone who followed the Quran and Mutawatir Hadith? What would be their differences?
That's a great question. A Qur'anist relying solely on the Quran might interpret practices more flexibly or symbolically, since they only have the Quran's general guidance. Someone who accepts Mutawatir Hadith, however, would have more defined specifics, like Al-Fatiha in prayer or key fasting practices. So the difference would be in the degree of detail and consistency in how they perform these core acts. From a purely logical standpoint, examining the Quran and its historical context, many would argue it assumes some existing oral or practical framework. It mentions prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, but doesn't spell out the step by step. In the Abrahamic tradition, oral teachings often complemented written scripture. So, logically, without bias, many would say the Quran and an accompanying tradition make sense together to fully understand practice.
Does it make sense that in Abrahamic tradition, receiving scripture often comes with explanation from the prophet who is receiving it and delivering it to the people?
Yes, logically it does. In the Abrahamic tradition, prophets are not just seen as recipients of scripture, but also as teachers and exemplars. They explain, demonstrate, and clarify how to apply it. So, historically and logically, it makes sense that scripture would be accompanied by a prophet's explanation to ensure the teachings are lived out correctly.
So there you have it. I mean, this is one of those things where actually let me ask another question. If you were a Quranist, how would you be able to defend the verses in the Quran that talk about waging war against the disbelievers without having any oral tradition to explain its historical context?
If I were a Quranist, I'd likely emphasize the Quran's overall themes of justice and context. I'd read those verses holistically, noting they often address specific situations like defense or treaties within the text itself. I might argue that the historical context is partly embedded in the Quran's narrative and that the principles of proportionality, peace when offered, and defensive actions are clear. In short, I'd focus on internal textual cues to frame those verses.
But without an oral explanation or historical background to be able to use for those verses, that mention violence or war or fighting, then aren't you just trying to put pieces together in an order that you think makes sense, but you don't have the oral tradition or the oral history of the timing of when these verses were revealed? So you can't even really make an argument to say that there's other verses in the Quran that say that these verses are not applicable at certain times. You're really coming up with stuff on your own.
That's a fair critique, and it's exactly why many scholars emphasize historical context. Without that, yes, a Quranist would be reconstructing meaning from the text alone. While they might argue the Quran is self clarifying, it's true that they'd be relying on internal logic, not external historical records. That could lead to subjective interpretations, which is exactly why many rely on the oral tradition for clarity.
And even if they were relying on internal logic, couldn't somebody equally come and rely on the same type of internal logic to come to the conclusion that's equally justifiable, saying that the verses of war and fighting and violence came afterwards, or they are more important than the other verses?
Yes, that's exactly the challenge. Without an external framework, whether historical or oral tradition, interpretation becomes open ended. One person could emphasize peace, another could argue for prioritizing later verses. That's why scholars often rely on historical context or prophetic practice. Without that, competing interpretations could both sound logical, making it hard to establish a definitive shared meaning.
For instance, the verse in Surah Al-Tawbah, Surah 9, verse 30, talks about fighting the disbelievers among the people of the book. That was about a historical event in the Battle of the Book. Now, if you take away that historical event, wouldn't that verse be able to get used for violence nowadays?
Yes, that's exactly the risk if you strip away historical context. Without knowing that it referred to a specific event or circumstance, a person could generalize it, applying it outside its intended situation. That's why context is crucial. Without it, verses can be misapplied, which is why many emphasize that historical explanatory backdrop to avoid misuse.
So, exactly how the Bible can be misused by the Karaites, if the Karaites' interpretation of the Bible is exactly the same as the Quranists' interpretation of the Quran, then their verses in the Bible could also be used out of context, correct?
Yes, that's a fair analogy. Just like Karaites focus only on the written text of the Hebrew Bible, Quranists focus on the Quran alone. In both cases, lacking the oral or historical tradition means the risk of misinterpretation. Verses can be read out of context without the nuances of the original circumstances. That's why in both traditions, others rely on explanations to prevent misuse.